Do you think Paul saw Jesus as capital G God, Yahweh?
Well, he calls Jesus the image of God. For Paul, this is what God looks like in sandals.
Are you calling Paul like an ancient abolitionist?
Of course.
How exactly did Paul change when he started to follow Jesus and preach Jesus' gospel to the Gentiles?
I think the idea that Paul converts from Judaism to Christianity is absolutely incorrect. And I think that's the consensus of modern scholarship, to be honest with you. If you said to Paul, the future is going to be Roman Christianity, Paul would be horrified. I think he would simply weep.
Hello and welcome to the discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for thoughtful conversations about God, philosophy, religion, history, music, and more. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. Perhaps the most influential convert of all time was the Apostle Paul. He started off as a zealous Pharisaic Jew who persecuted the early Christian church and then had a life-changing experience in which Jesus appeared to him. That set him on a new course beyond Judaism as an apostle of Jesus to the Gentiles. But the scholar joining and teaching us today might take some issue with that summary. He says that Paul's conversion is often exaggerated because even after his vision of Jesus, he continued to identify as a Jew, even still as a Pharisee. Look at Acts 23, verse 6, for example. My guest has been on the channel before. We had a great conversation about metaphor and resurrection. Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies at DePaul University, he's been one of the most influential and maybe controversial New Testament historians. He has a new book out this year called Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. It's an intriguing work. I enjoyed reading it, and it'll serve as the basis for our conversation. Without further introduction, Dr. John Dominic Crossan. It's good to see you again.
Glad to be with you again, Nahoa. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
I was telling you right before we got on that in English class there's an allotted time for sustained silent reading, and that's when I got to read your book just in school, reading Paul the Pharisee. I really enjoyed reading it, and one interesting thing about your book is that, in your own words, you have constantly and consistently chosen history with some apologetics uh, in Paul's letters over apologetics with some history in Luke Acts. So before we really get into who the historical Paul was, I would like to talk about Luke Acts. So you say that Luke's stories about Paul's speeches are fabricated. They are, quote, not even good historical fiction, end quote. So how might you establish this to convince a more conservative scholar?
Okay. And I may have to start a little wider if you'll allow me, Nahoa, on
Sure,
that.
of course.
In the past, when I was working on Paul, I tended to dip into Luke to take this, not take that. And it was a little bit like a buffet, like that,
Mm.
don't like that. What I did this time, and I really did it, is I left Paul aside for about a year. And I had the time, of course. And I focused on Luke Acts. And I'm saying Luke Acts now. The first thing I had to decide was this is not a book and its later sequel,
Hmm.
connecting back, of course, but a two-volume, two-scroll actually, two-scroll book that was conceived, born, uh,
Hmm.
printed, the whole thing all at once. And that Luke intended it to be from what we call the Gospel according to Luke 1:1 to the end of the Acts of the Apostles. And that if you don't read it like that, you're not going to get what Luke intended. So I start with that principle. Focus on Luke, find out what's he up to. Don't just go taking what you like. That lacks integrity. So here's what I did. At the beginning of the second century, Rome, Josephus at the end of the first century, and say Tacitus at the beginning of the second century, they got their story down about these weirdo Christians. We execute their founder over there, Christ. We executed him. And would you believe it? Even after that, the movement still came, Tacitus says, all the way to Rome, where everything rotten arrives eventually. So they're trying to explain, they have their story. They have their narrative about Christianity. And it's rather dangerous. You're the followers, right, of an executed founder? Who? So Luke's going to try to do what we call today control the narrative. He's going to write a story. He's not going to write philosophical disputes, which the second century, lots of Christians wrote philosophical disputes like Justin Martyr. He wanted to tell a different story. A different story. So it is apologetics. That's his function. And if you don't like it, Luke would say to you, tough. That's what I'm doing. And yeah, I might say to him, well, yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount you can say in apologetics. You might leave out stuff, but can you really say that all the trouble is caused by the Jews, Luke? I mean, if I'm a Roman official and my town is nice and quiet, and then comes Paul and all of a sudden there's riots, you're going to tell me, well, the Jews rioted, but they weren't doing it before Paul arrived. Now, that sounds like more of the same stuff. Jesus arrives, there's trouble. Paul arrives, there's trouble. So what Luke has to do is write an apologetical narrative. History is subservient to apologetics. And again, I say, if you don't like it, read something else. But it's also brilliant because of everyone in the whole New Testament, including Jesus, Luke is the only one who got it right. Luke claims that the future is not Jewish Christianity, but Roman Christianity. It's like as if he were to say, I'm not saying this obviously, the future is Constantine. And Luke got it right. Whether you like it or not, Luke got it right. The future is Roman Christianity. So he tells his whole story to, in a way, point into the future and to start the future happening.
You said in Luke Acts, apologetics is subservient to history. I'm sure you're familiar with the classic arguments in favor of Luke Acts historical reliability, right? There's people point to archaeological evidence indicating precise historical detail, coincidental connections and theological coherence with Paul's letters, the we passages, for the audience if you're not familiar. At several points in Acts, Paul or Luke or the author switches from kind of a third person description to, and then we went to this place, and then we, right? And so he talks in the first person, which is seen to indicate eyewitness testimony. Even Luke's prologue is seen to explicitly express his care for truth. So I'm curious, why are you mostly unmoved by these attempts to demonstrate general reliability?
No, because they're quite right. Luke, scholars think that Luke actually knows Paul's letters. He certainly knows where Paul was. I mean, he gets all the places. Yeah, of course, Luke has excellent information. Let me insist, excellent information. That's not his intention. He has, if you will, his own interpretation. Let me give you an example so all of this isn't so vague. I'm going to begin with the first volume, Luke. Most scholars agree, and I would agree, that one of the major sources that Luke uses is Mark's Gospel. Now, we're talking about the first volume. We call it the Gospel according to Luke. Mark begins his story of Jesus, public life, with a magnificent day of success at Capernaum. Everyone loves him. He cures people. He preaches in the synagogue. It's a great launch to Mark's Gospel, if you will.
Right.
Now, Luke comes along and he's going to write that story. That's his source, so we can check him against his source. All of a sudden, instead of a magnificent day of success at Capernaum, it's a day of almost lethal failure at Nazareth.
Hmm.
Jesus comes into the synagogue. You can read it in Luke chapter 4. He comes into the synagogue, announces this is the day of the Spirit is here. Everyone seems great. Everything looks good. Then all of a sudden, inexplicably, Jesus brings in two cases in the Old Testament where God preferred, let me say, the way he tells the story, Gentiles over Jews. There's a riot and they try to kill him. Now, I don't believe for 1 second there's murderous Jews in hometown Nazareth who tried to kill Jesus. By the way, in the very next verse, Jesus is often having great success everywhere.
Hmm.
That's Luke preparing us for Paul, which tells me that as he's writing Luke chapter 4, he knows where he's going all the way to the end of Acts. Because Paul's going to run into the same problem. He'll go into synagogues, everything seems to be going well, the Gentiles will show interest, there'll be a riot. So I can watch Luke actually taking a source, Mark, which we have, luckily, and watch what he does to it. So I'm going to say, from that, I'm going to take the conclusion, be very careful with Luke Acts on Jews. Now, let me just give another example from Acts this time.
Sorry, before you do that, I have a
Go
couple
on, sorry.
follow-up questions about.
Go
So,
on.
um, was it unprecedented for um, for people in this time and place to want to kill a new prophet whom they see as blasphemous, to maybe stone someone they see as a heathen or something like that? That's one question, which has a whole answer, I'm sure. And then also the next verse after it says, they wanted to throw him down a
Yeah.
cliff, was
Yeah.
he passed through their midst and went on his way, which is sort of mysterious. Uh, I'm curious what you think that could mean. How did he just pass by these people wanting to kill him, at least in the mind of the author?
Oh, as far as Luke is concerned, this is a miracle.
Mm.
You can't kill Jesus and at Nazareth, he's going to be killed in Jerusalem by God's plan, Luke might say, or something like that. No,
Mm.
he just disappears. He can't create how would I call it, a crowd rushing in to save him or something like that. No, he, as far as he's concerned, this is pure invention. Let me be very clear about that. Now, to answer your question, could somebody get killed? Of course they could. Anytime, any place, including modern America. People
Right.
get killed. Yeah, of course. But let me be very blunt. In the first century, the monopoly on execution was held by Rome.
Hmm.
Now, you might get a lynching. A lynching could happen, but there would not be any official. The priests in Jerusalem, for example, could not put somebody to death. Lynchings are always possible, but Rome had a monopoly on execution. So, in answer to your question, no, lynchings can always happen, anywhere, anytime, any place, old or new. But the monopoly was at Rome. By the way, in your early first question, you asked me about the speeches. If somebody wants to argue with me that each of those speeches was given, I'm not going to bother arguing with them. But here's the truth. It was part of your education, a classical education in the first century, and I got a real big whiff of it, of 5 years of a classical education in my own experience, that you're expected to be able to write speech in context, speech in character. For example, the teacher might say to you, you have just been defeated by the Roman army and you're retreating and you're trying to console your defeated troops. We take it that way.
Mm.
Tell me what you would say to them.
Mm.
Or we have the case of Agricola, the Roman general in the northeast corner of Scotland, I think. Tacitus creates a speech for Agricola to give to his troops. These people are rubbish. We've chased them all over the country. Now let's finally kill them all and go home. Then he turns around, Tacitus, and gives Calgacus, who's the the rebel leader, a magnificent speech. It's one of the most magnificent speeches ever. You know, these Romans, they want to conquer the world. They make a desert and call it peace. That's that fabulous line. They make a desert and call it peace. That was said by a Roman author on the lips of a rebel chieftain. And if that was in the New Testament, we would say nobody would ever say a Roman would say that. No, Romans would. Yes, they would. You're trained to do it. So when I read Luke, I can say, okay, whether this speech was given or not, or whether it came down to him in oral traditions or whatever, he's going to write it as he thinks it should be said if somebody was giving this speech in the year, say, 110, 120, rather than in the 50s. That's what he's trained to do. He's an expert rhetorician.
Right. So I've learned that ancient Greco-Roman authors and historians are trained in rhetoric, and some writing practices are write a speech, right, in context. And I'm aware that I think Josephus, when recounting the same event in different books or different volumes, would put
Yes.
different speeches on someone's lips. So, I mean, and that's interesting. I didn't learn that until I prepared for a discussion with Dr. Craig Keener. But Keener differs a little bit because he'll say, he acknowledges, of course, that was a practice. That's what you're trained to do. But if you look at the approaches of great historians such as Thucydides, Herodotus, even Josephus, Pliny, Lucian, Tacitus, you see
Yeah.
that there's a blend of of how you phrase it, right, in a very sophisticated way, but it'll still have a historical core. And so, according to Dr. Keener, there's Lucan, if we're going back to Acts, there's Lucan composition and faithful reporting. And when you look at the speeches, it's a blend of those. So it's phrased like the great, writer and author and rhetorician Luke would say it, but it does preserve the heart of what Paul or what Peter, what they were saying. So
Yeah.
why do you think there's a heavy emphasis on the composition and not the reporting?
Yeah, because of the whole thing. If you just focus on the words, of course, Luke is not making this stuff up.
Hmm.
This is the general teaching of his Christian churches, of course. But I am much more interested in what happens. For example, let me take that case that I gave of Luke 4. I
Okay.
am more interested in what happens. If you were somebody say to me, well, I think Jesus could really have given that speech at anywhere and said, today the Spirit is among you and Isaiah is fulfilled. Could Jesus have given that speech? I don't argue against it. What I am going to argue is I don't think gratuitously Jesus suddenly brings in two Gentile cases from the Old Testament
Hmm.
and in effect says, see how God prefers Gentiles to Jews. That's the tone of the speech. Not God also makes room for Gentiles. And then all of a sudden they want to kill him. No, that is not history. And no, it is anti-Semitism in plain language.
Hmm.
2nd century. Now let me give you the second example
Okay.
from Luke. Again, the most famous, I suppose, story about Paul, maybe the one on the road to Damascus is the more famous. But when he gets out of Damascus through the window over the gate, they're watching the gates, remember, and he has to escape through the wall. Remember that story?
Hmm.
Okay. Now, Paul gives it to us in 2 Corinthians. So we've got it from Paul. And I have no reason to doubt him because he's kind of laughing at himself. Roman heroes would be in the first over the wall into the city. He's the first out of the city, so he's mocking himself. He's laughing his exit strategy. All right, why is he doing it? Because he says basically the Nabateans are guarding the gate to arrest me. Now, if we have time, that fits absolutely well into the history of the time. Aretas IV has taken over and is pushing north towards Damascus. Okay, that works. Now, I look at Luke's account of it. Now, first of all, let me say Luke knows the story. Wow, he knows the story. But there's one change in the story. That is, who's guarding the gates? The Jews in order to kill me, not the Nabateans in order to arrest him. Now, I don't want to argue. I take it for granted he did come over the wall to escape Damascus. But I want to watch what Luke did to it. I think Luke knows the story, and he knows the Nabateans were there, and he makes it the Jews the same way as he did in Luke 4. So that's what I'm interested in. If somebody wants to argue with me whether it was this gate or that gate, this part of the wall, or they'll show you the gate today in Damascus. We were there in 2010, and they'll show you the exact place where he came over the gate. In fact, there's an example of the book of the basket there. Not they don't claim it to be the real one, but there's an example. The Bab Kishan, as it were. What I really am after is that Jews did not guard the gates of an Arab city under the Romans. They just didn't. That's not good history, even. If somebody did that in a historical novel, I wouldn't accept it if I was the editor. That's not history, that's apologetics. Watch out for them Jews. They're always causing trouble. So that's what's at issue for me, Noah. It's when your apologetics not only defends yourself, but defends yourself by attacking somebody else. That's where we have to ask, is this the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? That's where due diligence becomes important. And that's what I'm watching for. You can defend yourself, and it's fair enough, because in one sense, the Christians are not using violence. But are they subversive of Roman law and order? Yes. Yes. Not violently. So Pilate got it right about Jesus. He crucified Jesus, but he didn't round up his followers. That's what you do with non-violent leaders. You don't bother with the followers. So that's what I'm really after. That's the issue. I'm quite willing to say, when Luke, say at Pisidian Antioch, Luke's make the long speech, of course he's talking, of course it comes out of the Christian classic speeches, of course. But what happens there is you give the speech, everything looks fine, then the Gentiles start showing interest, and all of a sudden the Jews riot. That's the pattern I'm after.
I see. You mentioned that Luke knew Paul's letters and that he used Mark as a source. In your book, you mentioned in Acts 15, there's, quote, a letter that was cited verbatim as if it were taken from archival records, end quote.
Yeah.
So how seriously do you consider the suggestion that Luke had access to actual records of the primitive movement? I'm basically wondering, what were Luke's historical sources? And then sort of by contrast, what were literary devices that he used?
Okay. And that's a big question. So if
Right.
if I forget it when I get into this, let me look at Acts 15. If somebody wants to focus at Acts 15 and say, and argue that this letter actually came out, what I'm worried about is when I compare Galatians, as you know, Paul's account of this, I consider that Galatians, the incident in Jerusalem and at Antioch, is the same story that Luke is telling in Acts 15. Now, for example, I don't focus on the letter. I look at the whole thing. There's a big debate about whether male Gentile converts have to become, as it were, full Jews and be circumcised before they can become Christians. That's a debate. Can new converts have to be, are they sort of, do they remain Jews? Where are they? What kind of status are they? it's a question that we know quite well,
Yeah,
except
big
it's not about
debate.
circumcision. For us, about sex. Who
Hmm.
fits into the little categories that we have established? We have our little categories. There's Jews. There's Gentiles. What if somebody is wants to be a faithful Jew but not be circumcised? What if somebody wants to worship the Jewish God, even follow Jewish morality, even attend the synagogue, but has no intention, if male, of getting circumcised? So maybe our little categories are being debated a bit. That's what's going on in the first century. We have different categories, but we have the same nasty debates. Anyway, read Acts 15. Paul is not quoted there, Peter is quoted. First of all, James is in charge. Okay, fair enough. James is in charge. I think that's historical. But who is the apostle of the Gentiles in chapter 15? It's Peter. He talks about, and he talks verbatim, by the way, about what is in chapter 11 and 12, from our way of counting, of course. He Peter is the one who has the great conversion to become the apostle of the Gentiles in this vision he has in chapter 11 and tells in chapter 12 and tells a third time in chapter 15. And James refers to it. He says, Peter has told us. Paul and Barnabas are there and they never get to open their mouth. I mean, verbatim. They're not quoted. They're, if you read that and don't know anything about Paul, you'd say, well, in this very peaceful little miniature Roman Senate, as it were, everyone is very peaceful. Uh, James is in charge, and that's good. Somebody should be in charge. Peter is the next most important person. And then there's, I think, Silas and those who have to carry the letter. Oh, and by the way, Paul and Barnabas were there.
Hmm.
You wouldn't have a clue they were any importance. Just read it and kind of block out Galatians from your eyes and your ears and think if you'd come to the conclusion, wow, Paul and Barnabas are really important. They're just there, but they don't get to speak. And they don't get to carry the letter even. They kind of go along with it. So when I look at Acts 15 as a whole, I don't just focus on the letter, but the letter fits into the ensemble. The letter fits into Lucan theology. If I was reading that as a Roman, I'd be very impressed, by the way. I would say, wow, these Christians really know how to run a meeting. It's like a well-run Roman Senate meeting. Somebody's in charge. So the consultation, make a decree, the letter is set out. Wow, they're really peaceful people. It's these Jews I see are having riots all the time. So Christians good, Jews bad. Yeah, I'm getting the message. You're getting the message from Luke Acts. It's theological anti-Judaism. That's what worries me. I can, if somebody insisted this was a letter, and that Luke has a letter, but I don't think it dates from sometime around the year 40, that letter. So that's where I am now. It's bigger than just this little source, that little source. It's how he uses all his sources with a consistent message.
Hmm. But if the author, I'm just calling him Luke, if the author of Luke
Yeah,
Acts
yeah. Let's call
was
him Luke.
a Judaized Greek, or they're called God worshippers in the first
Yeah.
century. So interesting, where these are people who are Gentiles, but they sympathize with Judaism. They support the synagogue, attend synagogue, maybe observe Sabbath, and you suggest that the author, or that the Gentiles that Paul first converted were these God worshippers, and that the author of Luke Acts probably was himself such a Jew sympathizing Greek. So, so if he does sort of support the synagogue in that sense, and I mean he's, you know, part of the Christian movement as well. So master is, his master and his leader is Jesus, a Jew. Then I'm just sort of struggling to wrap my mind around the idea that he has so consistently put anti-Semitism or Jewish theology
Yeah,
into
yeah.
his works if he sympathizes with Judaism and he's a follower of a Jew. You know what I mean?
Let me be very careful now. I I said he was. The term is was a God worshiper, God fearer. Josephus uses the term Judaizer, so it's possible. Let me make certain that your audience knows what we're talking about.
Okay.
Because we're trying to think of the nice, simple Jews and Gentiles or Jews
Right.
and Greeks. Okay. Now, what we have to face, and we know this, we know this from Josephus if we never had it in Luke Acts. There was an in between category.
Mhm.
Let me back up a bit. I think, from my point of view, the genius of Judaism was that you could, of course, if you wanted to be a full Jew and convert, of course you could. Nobody said you had to be born a Jew. If I was a Roman male aristocrat in the first century and wanted to become a full Jew, I would be circumcised. And I wouldn't be able to perform most of the things I would want to do as an aristocrat after that. I would be a convert. That was possible. Now, those converts would probably create a lot of trouble for Judaism because the family now says let's say it's their only son. He now become a Jew. He can't do this. He can't do that. He can't go through the course of honors and everything. He's lost to the family. That could create trouble. So the genius of Judaism was, my terminology now, was to invent conversion by attraction. If we're as good as we think we are, just let's be ourselves and see if Gentiles will start to respect our God. You mentioned it. Start following our morality. Start attending our synagogue for instruction, but will not be circumcised if male. Now, think, by the way, women. How would you know a Judaizing woman? She controls the kitchen in any case. That was a far easier process. There was no circumcision involved, and you wouldn't even know it. And I'm kind of inclined to think that Poppaea, Nero's wife, was a
Oh, right.
God worshiper. You know, so that was there. Now, one of the things we have to understand about Paul to explain is how does Paul, after 20 years, say from the 30s to the 50s, write to the Romans, and I'm finished in the East, I'm going to the West now, off to Spain. I say, Paul, I could name on one hand the cities where you've been. Yeah, they're capital cities mostly, but there's hundreds of Roman cities you haven't even been. Paul could move so fast because he was not going to the forum or the agora and speaking straight to pagans and trying to tell them about the resurrection where I think they'd be laughing, or trying to tell them you don't have to be circumcised. Say, excuse me, Paul, I never intended to be circumcised. What are you talking about? Now imagine Paul in synagogues poaching, that's my term, the God worshippers. They know all about Judaism. They might even know more about Judaism than somebody who's grown up and taken it for granted. Those are the ones Paul's going after. That's going to cause trouble all around, not only with Jews in the synagogue, but also with God worshippers who don't agree with this. And it may spill into the streets and get the Romans involved. So to understand Paul and to try and imagine how pure pagans could understand Galatians, well, Paul gave them some oral. Any good pagan listening to Paul would say, okay, now I hear this, there's this new God called Jesus. Okay, I got to put him in with my other gods. Good, I got it. One more important God. I like to be respectful to all of them. So Jesus is in there. And Paul says, no. There's not one more God. Paul is moving so fast. Or put another way, the mission is so successful because it doesn't, as in my term, have to lay track. The track is laid down by the God worshipping program of Judaism. That explains everything to me. Explains why Paul goes so fast, why people can understand Paul. But now, come to Luke. I think this is absolutely arguable. And if somebody says it's not, I don't care. It's just trying to explain why he's the only one who seems interested in talking about them. Luke, I think, was a God worshipper. Now, here's his problem. I think he's writing in the early 2nd century. That's after the Great War of 66 to 74. Would you want, say, at that time, to say, I'm a Jew? Luke has to walk a tightrope. He has to say, well, Christianity is Jewish, because he doesn't want to say it's a brand new religion, because the Romans come down with a ton of marble on new religions. They're usually subversive. So he doesn't want to say Christianity is a new religion. He wants to say we're descended from Judaism. But Judaism, if I know anything about Judaism as a Roman, we just had a huge war with them. It took our best troops over there in years to suppress it. Is this more of the same trouble? No, says Luke. Judaism expected a Messiah, and when the Messiah came, they rejected him. We took him. We are the true Jews. We Gentiles. We Gentile God worshippers, as it were, are the true Jews. They're no longer the true Jews. Now, that's an explosive message, especially after there's been a war between Rome and the Jews in their homeland, and Rome has punished all of Judaism, by taking the money that used to go to the temple at Jerusalem and applying it to the great Roman temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome. The fear must have been, and this is what scares Josephus, they might forbid Judaism. So Luke has to write a tightrope, as it were, between saying we are not a new religion, we're the heirs of Judaism, but Judaism has failed itself and we have not. So yes, that's an answer to your question. Luke can be absolutely knowledgeable about the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, because he was a God worshipper, but also insists that we're the true heirs of Judaism. The true heirs. Judaism is no longer the true heir of itself. That's the message of Paul. That's why the Jews will go to the end of Luke Acts. The Jews are trying to kill Paul. They're plotting to assassinate him. So the Jews are the villains. The heroes of this story are the Christians. Now, let's not talk about Christ, but Luke is going to insist that when Jesus was put to death, what happened? Well, the centurion at the cross said he was innocent. The puppet prince Antipas says he was innocent. That's why he's only in Luke. And Pilate says it 3 times he's innocent. So the chorus of innocence, the perfect storm of innocence around Jesus at the end of the first volume, Paul at the end of the second volume, exactly the same, the tribune. So he's up from a centurion, as it were, Herod Agrippa II, and Festus, I think it was. All Christians are innocent. Now, if I was a Roman reading all of this, I'd say, how come Christians are so innocent, but they always seem to be in court? They're always under accusation.
Now, I mean, there's a lot to think about, and so I appreciate your
Sorry, there's a lot
responses.
there. Yeah.
No. It's good. I'd rather you explain your full thought process rather
Yeah.
than just a little
Thank you.
bit to kind of censor yourself. Of course, one thing I'm thinking about is coherence and contradiction. Basically, in what ways do they agree, and in what ways do they disagree?
Well, if I could begin with the fundamental one, Paul is aware that from his experience, the nations, I almost wish hadn't used the term the Gentiles, but the nations
Hmm.
were accepting Christ as the Messiah. Now, this is his experience with the God worshipper as I see it. This is his experience with them, that they're accepting. He's aware that many of his fellow Jews are not accepting it. He says that in Romans. It's a mystery, he says. So if you said to Paul, the future is going to be Roman Christianity, Paul would be horrified.
Hmm.
I think he would. I mean, he would not say you're wrong. I think he would simply weep
Hmm.
for his people. Now, as we know, what happened is Judaism remained a strong, vibrant religion. Christianity became Roman, and whether we betrayed our identity is a huge question at the price of having uh, Constantine convert to us. I often wonder what would have happened if Constantine had converted to Judaism. Of course, he wouldn't have been circumcised. That could have been easily arranged. But what if he'd converted to Judaism? I often wonder, Judaism had a longer experience with empires. Maybe they wouldn't have swallowed it. Maybe we wouldn't have had a Jewish empire as we had a Christian empire. Anyway, that's counterfactual speculation. So that's the huge difference. Paul hoped till the day he died that somehow there would be a, I don't want to say Judeo-Christian, I really don't want to use that, a, as Isaiah had imagined, that the Gentiles would troop to Jerusalem. The Gentiles would troop to Jerusalem, not the Jews would troop to Rome. The Gentiles would come to Jerusalem, beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, have a magnificent messianic feast together. And nothing about kosher on the feast and nothing about getting circumcised as they're coming into Jerusalem. That's the vision of Isaiah. You know, hundreds of years before Paul. It's there already. And when they talked about the great feast in Jerusalem that God would give to bring peace to the world, you know, they didn't say, well, Jupiter will be running this feast in Rome. No, they didn't, because they'd seen Jupiter and weren't impressed. They looked at their own God as the one who would imagine peace, and we would beat our swords into plowshares, not God. So they imagined that. Now, what's happening, unfortunately, in the first century is the Gentiles do stream to Jerusalem, and they burn the city to the ground and destroy the temple.
Right.
Now, I could see if I was a Jew around the year 100 saying, I don't see, guys, how you've fulfilled our visions, our prophecies. Yeah, I see how the Gentiles, many of them are worshiping the true God, but I don't see them beating their swords into plowshares or anything else. I'm getting a glimpse of Roman Christianity, I might say, if I was there in the year 100, if I read Luke especially. So that's the huge difference. Paul died because he tried to take a unifying collection to Jerusalem so that Jews and Greeks could worship God together. He died for it. He brought it. And he knew it was dangerous because at the end of Romans, he says, I'm going into the lion's den. And I'm not so certain I'll be as lucky as Daniel. So that's the huge difference. Their vision of the future. Now, if you ask coherence, for example, I'm completely convinced that the second mission, for me, the second mission, that is the mission to Cyprus and the Anatolian Plateau in, what is it, Luke, Acts 13 and 14, is an accurate event, especially because it's Barnabas and Paul. Barnabas and Paul. It's not Paul and Barnabas. Paul's not in charge. It's Barnabas is running the mission and Paul is with him. I think that's valid historical data, which doesn't mean, it really doesn't mean that all the events in there can be taken as factual. Each one has to be checked by itself. But I think, yes, there was a mission out of Antioch to Cyprus and across into the Anatolian plateau up to Pisidian Antioch, places like that. And that Paul was second in command. Take out that. Barnabas was leading the mission. Paul was with him. I don't know he was second in command. That's Luke. So yes, I think that happened. And I also think, by the way, another thing that you mentioned, the four we text, the area when all of a sudden the third person goes into the first person, we. I think Luke has data from that. I don't think that means somebody was with Luke and taking notes down with Luke when he's writing or something. I mean that Luke was not there, but I think he has a source. There is a we source that dates back to the time of Paul, the late 50s, and that Luke has it. Yes. So when I look at Acts, I don't dismiss the whole thing. I read it the way I read Josephus or anything else. What's he doing? What's he up to? How does this work with what he is doing? And all of a sudden, I see these we sources. I don't think he's suddenly making that up. That makes no sense to me.
Okay.
So that would be coherence.
Right. You discussed some ways that they agree on specific events, and then also big differences in their visions of Christianity and the future of Christianity. And that whole section that we've been talking about is sort of preliminary, but it's very important, I think, because Luke Acts is usually seen as one of the main sources about Paul. So I think it's good that we really assess that work. Now moving beyond.
Could I insist? It is a main source, please. Remember, what I am saying is that Luke Acts must be handled almost by itself up front before you get to Paul.
Right.
Really, I disagree with some of my scholars who go in there and say, "Oh, this didn't happen." That I want to see the integrity of how do you see what Luke Acts is doing, and how does everything you take in or leave out work with that overall thing. Show me what he's up to. So, for example, giving you the two examples, I will understand him on the Jews only within his overall. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, yeah. Thank you for that clarification. You approach it sort of more holistically, trying to see Acts in total before you get to Paul's letters. Right.
Thank you. That's good.
Yeah. So now I kind of want to talk about Paul's letters or Paul beyond the book of Acts. Now you talk about the environments in which Paul is to be understood. There's a Jewish matrix, a Christian environment, a Greco-Roman context, and even a larger evolutionary picture. You object to the many people who describe Paul's experience as an instantaneous conversion out of Judaism into a radically different Christian movement. According to your work, Paul continued to identify within the Jewish tradition. You call him a Messianic or Christic Pharisee. So could you bring us into the world of first century Judaism and explain how Paul's adherence to Pharisaism in particular sort of accounts for his theology?
Okay, let me be very careful. I think the idea that Paul converts from Judaism to Christianity is absolutely incorrect. I'm not saying you're saying that. And I think that's the consensus of modern scholarship, to be honest with you. The reason it's often said is because Christianity doesn't exist yet. I'm saying my reason is that when I read Paul, I find text after text insisting that he's a Jew, a fervent Jew, faithful to his people. I take him seriously in that. That's what he tells me. Now, we're, remember, we're not using Luke.
Right. Could you
We,
give us
we,
some
we
examples of those texts
yeah.
where he calls himself a Jew?
Um, well, I give them all in the book.
Right, right.
He says I'm a Jew. He says I am a Pharisee. I'm born. I'm circumcised. Uh, he gives us his. He says I wish I could be cursed for my people. If
Mm.
I'd rather die with my people, if they are going to be cursed, then I'm going to be cursed with them. Oops! Wow, that's that's the strongest thing he says. He talks about persecutions from my people. Uh, there's at least 4 or 5 major ones, and they're not in passing. They're
Mm.
like cries from the heart. I think, it's not that Paul has left him. He really doesn't care what happened to him. He's horrified by it. He he says it's a divine mystery. I can't even understand it. Okay, I
No, yeah,
won't say.
those are good examples.
Yeah, those are good examples. Lucas says it's jealousy. Paul says it's mystery. Why on
Mm.
earth did God allow this to happen? And he has no answer for it, by the way. He says, I just hope that maybe when they see the Gentiles coming in, they will come in themselves. Maybe that's what God is up to, that they'll see the Gentiles coming in and then they will come in themselves. He's trying to understand what God's up to. All right. Now, in one sense, I don't mind using the convert because Paul was a persecutor. That's a fact. Luke says that. He says that a couple of times. He's a persecutor. Now, you could stop being a persecutor and mind your own business. Okay? You could stop being a persecutor and support Messianic Christic theology to Jews. Paul does a complete, I don't know, if 180 from being being a persecutor to being an apostle,
Right.
to being a supporter, but to the Gentiles. Wow, that is a big leap. I mean, he could just speak to his fellow Jews. So that requires some explanation. Where did he get that idea? Well, we've already touched on it. He knows Isaiah. He knows that in the Messianic era, the Gentiles are supposed to be streaming, as I said, to Jerusalem. Okay, so he knows all of that. So in Galatians, all Paul says, nothing about this Damascus road. All he says is God revealed to us, he calls it an apocalypsis, God revealed to us his son that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And he compares that to if you want to use the term, the call, let me use the term vocation, of Isaiah and of Jeremiah, who are called to the nations, or at least to speak to the nation, to speak about the nations as they do. He's called to go to the nations. That's all he tells us about it. And immediately, he says, immediately I went. That's where he says, I went into Arabia and all the rest of it. So immediately he went to the nearest Gentiles. So that's his own vision of what he is called to. And that's where I see it. Now, I don't believe, this is just my own understanding of human nature, that anyone can have this instantaneous conversion, say from communism to Catholicism, to use some examples from earlier times. I don't think that can happen like that without a psychotic break. There has to be a kind of a pivot. It could be, for example, that somebody who's experienced communism as very well organized, dedicated, committed, and then could see, well, Catholicism, very well organized, dedicated, committed. There's some pivot point. That's the way I understand human nature. If somebody else says to me, that's not the way it works, okay. I don't believe there could be an instantaneous, right up to this moment, I am X, and now I'm Y. I don't find that in my human experience. So I expect there to be some pivot, as it were. And that's where Pharisaism comes in for me. I think Paul tells us, of course, I'm not guessing, that he was a Pharisee. Now, I don't know if you want to go into that, but then the next thing would be to ask, when Paul says he was a Pharisee, and he says it, I think twice at least, what did that mean? What did a Pharisee mean in the first century? Because this is obviously before I suppose his sequence was, I was a Jew, I was a Pharisee, I was a persecutor, I was an apostle. I think that's the sequence. It's because he was a Pharisee, I think, that he was a persecutor. So I want to ask, what is a Pharisee in the first century? So when Paul says I'm a Pharisee, I know what he's talking about. How do I find out? Would that be fair enough as a question, or is that away from your questions?
Oh no, that's exactly what I want to understand. Like when the modern person thinks of here's the word Pharisee, they think, oh, hypocrite, right? Right. It's become a
Thank you.
synonym
Yes.
for that, um, in large part because Jesus in the Gospels has so many criticisms of the Pharisees, in particular, because there are specific Pharisees in front of him that he's kind of disputing with, but also it seems like on the whole, don't be like the Pharisees, right? So, so we have this idea that Pharisees are just kind of like hypocritical Jews, but
Yeah.
Pharisaism was a legitimate sect of Judaism, and I don't know if it's I honestly don't know if it's still a thing, or but basically, could you bring us into the world of ancient Pharisaism so that we
Okay.
understand what it really
Okay.
was and where Paul was coming from?
And I can't do that without doing really damage control on those images of nitpicking legalist hypocrites. And by the way, let me make certain I get back to the point.
Okay.
In chapter 5 of Matthew, Matthew may well have been, he certainly was a scribe. Matthew may well have been a Pharisee, by the way, Matthew.
Hmm.
In chapter 5, Jesus says, don't call people names, right? Okay. Now, how come then much later, or what's it, chapter is it 24 or whatever, all of a sudden, Jesus in Matthew is calling them brood of vipers and hypocrites, you're going to hell, hypocrites, 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 hypocrites. Wait a minute. If I was a Pharisee speaking to Matthew, I would say, wait a minute now, who's the hypocrite here? Jesus said, don't call names, love your enemies, all of that stuff. And now all of a sudden he's calling people names and telling them they're going to hell. I think your Jesus sounds like a hypocrite. The question we have to ask, just to get going, who changed their mind, Jesus or Matthew? And as I understand it, Matthew is in a serious fight for the center of his people. The Essenes, I consider the left wing. The Sadducees are sort of the right wing. The Pharisees are the center. And Pharisaic Jews or Messianic Jews are fighting for the control of the center. And that's a family fight then. So language gets very, very nasty. It's like a religious civil war, as it were. So I'm not surprised that Matthew is saying that stuff about the Pharisees. And I'm sure if I had any Pharisees from around the 70s or 80s, they're saying equally bad stuff about Matthew, except unfortunately Matthew says Jesus does. So that's what's going on. They're fighting for the center. All right. I I take as accurately that description of the Pharisees as I would take the description in a presidential campaign of one side describing the other.
Hmm.
Okay? It's polemics. It's polemics. So now, if I want to know about the Pharisees, I can't go to the New Testament really, though some things they are said. For example, it is said that the Pharisees believe in the resurrection and the Sadducees don't. Luke tells me that, but okay, fine. I go to Josephus. Now, Josephus is not neutral. I read him critically too, but Josephus is willing to tell us that the three groups, Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, he wants to protect them from the Romans. They're all philosophies. They're not religio-political factions fighting for leadership of their people in the cauldron of Roman imperialism. Oh no, they're philosophies. Nice people who just talk. All right, so He's being apologetic too. I recognize that. But he tells me two things about the Pharisees. They're very faithful to tradition, and they believe in the resurrection. Now, right away, that causes a problem. Because where in tradition is the resurrection mentioned? If I'm a Sadducee arguing with a Pharisee, I'm going to win this one. I'm going to say, it just ain't there. Show me in the Bible. In the Bible, it says when you die, you go down to Sheol and it's over and God punishes and rewards on this life. Read Deuteronomy, Paul, Deuteronomy 28. Let me use it that way. Where do you find this? Now, the Pharisees had an answer, of course. People always have an answer. They said, well, you're quoting what was written down from Sinai. I'm quoting the oral tradition from Sinai. Okay. Let's leave the argument. What did they mean by the term resurrection? That's what we have to ask. Okay, they're faithful to tradition. Everyone can claim that. Resurrection is something new. It is new. You can date it actually back to about the year 160 BCE and the time of the Maccabean martyrs, because this is a theological problem, and it's a huge problem. Deuteronomy said God rewards or punishes you. If you are obedient to God, rewarded. If you're disobedient to God, punished in this life. That explains why Daniel in the lion's den, faithful to God, and the lions become pussycats. The men in the fiery furnace, faithful to God, and all of a sudden the fiery furnace becomes a nice heat wave or something. All right, that sustained Israel all the time up until the time of the Maccabean martyrs. How do you explain a martyr? You're saying he's been put to death as a punishment for his sins, but he's dying for fidelity to God. So for the first time, and I think it is the first time in Israel, from 160s on, there's a new understanding of how God is just, not in this life alone, let me put it that way, but especially in the next life. There is, in other words, a next life of rewards and punishments. You can see it in the second book of Maccabees, for example, when the Maccabees, the mother with the 7 sons, they're being put to death, and they say they will accept it because God will give them life again. So they are dying in this life. There's no Daniel in the lion's den in the book of Maccabees. They're dying. But resurrection. Now, resurrection is a vision of what I call cosmic justice. It's not just that when you die or I die or anyone dies, they will be rewarded or punished by God individually. The theory of resurrection is that at the end of time, every single human being who has ever lived will rise. That's what the word means. The whole human race will rise to be judged corporately, as it were, and how it is done, not just individually, but corporately, and then heaven and hell as punishment or reward. That's the belief of a Pharisee, and I can see why that would have been extremely popular to ordinary people in the first century, being put to death, say, by Roman occupation. And where's the justice of God? Don't tell me, well, this person was good, so he's all right, this person was bad. We're dying on Roman crosses. 2,000 died in the year 4 BCE in Jerusalem. What about those 2,000 Jews? Did they all go up for individual judgments up and down? What about the 700? Well, this is after Paul, of course. In the year 70, the 500 a day who were crucified in Jerusalem. So the idea, the theme, the faith in cosmic justice, at least at the end of time. That's the Pharisaic faith, and that's why it's so popular. And I'm sure they must have been able to say, and that has come down to us as oral tradition. It's never been written down, but we know it. And people would have heard it and say, oh, so God will be just. So eventually there will be justice. not just for individuals, that goes back to Plato, but for the world. All right, so there will be justice for the Roman Empire and for us. That's the Pharisaic faith, and it was there if Jesus had never existed.
Hmm. And you're saying that served as the pivot point, or as a pivot point for Paul, because you already had this idea of resurrection baked in to Pharisee. It's one of the most appealing features about it, one of the distinctive features of Pharisaic theology. And so when Jesus dies and his, not just his message, but his movement and belief in his active life continues, Paul, it's easy for Paul to say, oh, he resurrected, right? And
Well,
he,
yeah.
no?
Let me go more slowly. Yes, I agree absolutely with what you just said, by the way. Let me go more slowly. I am willing to, I think Luke is right, if I can go back for a second, that Paul was born in Tarsus. I can see no reason whatsoever. If he said Athens or Alexandria, I might be a little bit nervous. But, it's like if somebody says you went to Harvard, well, yeah, I want to know. I'd like to see your transcript maybe. But so I think he was born in Tarsus and he grew up there, probably trained how to argue and protect himself in Tarsus. I don't think he went to Jerusalem. I think he went to Damascus for his graduate school. Let me put it that way, because okay, I won't get into that for the moment, but we might get back to it. So he goes to Damascus. He is a Pharisee. I think that happened in Damascus, by the way. I don't know if that would happen in Tarsus, but at least in Damascus. Now, I think what he's doing when he's persecuting, I don't think for a second he's persecuting in Jerusalem like Luke says he was, because Paul says, when I got to Jerusalem the first time, this is Galatians, they didn't even know who I was. They just heard of me. Well, you're a persecutor. So I think he started persecuting in Damascus. And here's what I imagine. In the Roman Empire, as I said, they had a monopoly on executions. But I think Paul was sort of orthodox enforcer, or enforcer of orthodoxy in the Damascus synagogue. What could he do? There were these Messianic Christics in the synagogue, of course. That's who he's persecuting, in the synagogue. What can he do about them? Well, he can pitch them out of the synagogue. Is that serious? Oh, yeah. If you've grown up as in the Jewish community and you're out of the synagogue, that doesn't just mean now I'm in the Gentile community. You've fallen between worlds. Everything, your identity and everything else. So that's serious. I don't mean it's not killing them, but it could financially maybe kill them. So he's a persecutor. He's in the synagogue. Now, you can't persecute without knowing the theory you're persecuting.
Right.
If I'm persecuting you seriously enough, I know what this messianic Christic delusion is. From my point of view, I know all about it. Nobody knows so much about you as the persecutor, if they're competent at least. They have to be ready to argue with you, and to argue with you, they have to know you. And of course, you're wrong. Now, here's where the pivot, as I understand from Paul. I'm Paul. I believe in the resurrection, which will happen, of course, at the Messianic age. You guys are claiming the Messianic age is here. There ain't no resurrection. So either I'm wrong, or what if, now I'm imagining the mind of Paul. I'm imagining 1 Corinthians 15. What if the resurrection has already begun with Jesus? Oh, but we thought the resurrection would all happen at the end of time. Or maybe the end of time is coming soon, so it's already started with Jesus. Paul doesn't have to worry about 2,000 years. So I think the pivot for Paul, the conversion, if you want to use that term, the vocation, the revelation, is I am right as a Pharisee because it has started already with Jesus. That's straight out of 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul argues if there's no general resurrection, there ain't any Jesus resurrection. If there ain't a Jesus resurrection, there ain't no general resurrection.
Right.
And you want to say, well, wait a minute, Paul, couldn't there be a general resurrection and nothing to do with Jesus? Or couldn't Jesus just have a special privilege, just for him? No, resurrection ain't for individuals. There's only one way resurrection could be applied to Jesus, according to Paul, the Pharisee, as the beginning, the first fruits, Paul's own language, of the general resurrection. So I see his Phariseeism as the pivot, that he remains a Pharisee, but becomes a messianic Christic Pharisee. And I don't say a Pharisaic messianic Christic, I say a messianic Christic Pharisee, because the big thing is that resurrection has begun. That's Paul, and that's the heart of Paul. Now, you can disagree with that, of course, if you want to. That's a separate issue. But that makes sense for me of his argument in 1 Corinthians 15, because you can't just have it for Jesus. You could have ascension for Jesus, of course. That's a separate issue. But resurrection means something in the first century, and you can't go making it mean something else.
Yeah, I mean, those are interesting points, and this is also fun for me. You know, I have a stoic face, but it's fun for me because Luke and First Corinthians are maybe my two favorite books in the Bible, and we're just discussing them back and forth. Luke 4, 1 Corinthians 15, and it's just like it's cool to sort of see the connections. And in another one of Paul's letters, besides First Corinthians, there's Galatians, and it's also said in Acts. We learn about these pretty major disagreements in the early church. So there were different perspectives and even disputes among church leaders about distinctly Jewish practices in light of their following Jesus. So, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, keeping kosher, and then maybe more broadly, how you treat the Jewish scriptures. So I'm wondering, how did early Jewish Christians, or Christic Jews, as you might say, such as Paul, reinterpret Jewish traditions upon following Jesus?
Well, in one sense, I'm going to say it's called faith. They two people, let's call them, for example, a Pharisaic Jew and a non-messianic Jew and a messianic Jew. Let me put it that way. Trying to keep it. They're both reading, let's say, Isaiah, and they're both reading all this gorgeous stuff, and it's magnificent stuff. The visions of Isaiah. It comes up. I mentioned it a couple of times. No one has ever done better than saying, it is the will of God that we beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, and we don't learn war anymore. And we sit each under our own vine and our own fig tree, not somebody's stolen fig tree, and we're never afraid. There ain't no better vision than we've ever had of that, if it can ever be. Now, they also say, they don't say, and by the way, we all have our own God. Nobody ever says that anywhere. And you'll have your Jupiter and your Zeus, and we'll have our Yahweh. Nah, they've seen these guys, and they're not impressed. They're going to say, our guy, at least, our God's a God of justice, where everyone should have a fair share. So the Gentiles, they say, and we might find this not acceptable, will have to come to Jerusalem to worship our God. Okay, now, Isaiah. If I'm reading Isaiah in the first century, let's say we haven't got to the point of the Great War of 66, when, as I said, the Gentiles streamed to Jerusalem to slaughter. Okay, I'm in the first century. I'm reading and disputing about Isaiah. And I say, now, I'm reading Isaiah about the Gentiles streaming to Jerusalem for this great feast that we're going to have, God's great feast. Now, will the Gentiles be circumcised kind of along the way somewhere, or will we have circumcisions clinics all around Jerusalem for all the nations when they come into Jerusalem? And I don't know the answer to that in the first century, but I suspect it might be get a life. I mean, you're just reading Isaiah. It's a prophecy. The day will come when the Gentiles will stream to Jerusalem for a great feast run by God. Okay, my question, because I like questions. I'm in the year, let me say the year 25, pick a nice round number, CE. I want to know, will we have clinics for circumcision all around Jerusalem so nobody gets into this great feast before chop chop? And then somebody else says, okay, whatever. Let's say the answer is yes to that. Now, I want a second answer. I want to know, is this great feast in Isaiah kosher or not? Is it kosher for everyone, so the Gentiles will adjust? Or is it kosher for none, so the Jews will adjust? Now, if nobody was asking those questions, I don't know how anyone was reading Isaiah, because they're obvious questions. So those are in the background as I see it. I don't know if I can prove they're being questioned, but as soon as you start talking about Jesus as the Messiah, and this is the Messianic age, those questions come roaring in with a vengeance. And the Gentiles are not streaming in huge crowds, but they're coming in individuals. So it is possible, at least feasible, to argue that any male who converts must become a full Jew, be circumcised, before they can become, let me use the word, a Messianic Christic. That's an absolutely possible answer. And the second answer is, if we have Messianic Christics, Jews, and non-Messianic Christic Jews, I got it wrong. If we have Messianic Christic Jews and Messianic Christic Gentiles, and they're having a feast together, is it kosher for all or kosher for none? That's the problem of Jerusalem and of Antioch. And I think it's absolutely to be expected. We shouldn't be surprised by it. And that there would be people on either side of it. And Paul would say quite correctly, if males have to be circumcised, then the Gentile mission, you can kiss it goodbye. We have to settle for an odd convert and for the God worshippers. And that's probably the position that a lot of Jews would have taken, quite logically, that of course if a Gentile wants to come to Jerusalem and be circumcised, of course that can be done. So I find the problems of the first century not brought up by some bad, evil person, but anyone who's thinking of these great visions from the Old Testament when the Gentiles were going to join should have been asking, if they weren't just so lost in the rhetoric and the ecstatic visions, that, yeah, but will the males be circumcised and will everyone be kosher? Those are first century questions that Isaiah would probably have said, oh, what are you talking about? But they are valid first century questions. So that's the matrix that I see operational.
Of course, Paul himself was circumcised, but I wonder, with respect to the other traditions I mentioned, did Paul, in his own practice, keep kosher, and did he keep the Sabbath and observe some days above others, and then also, like I was asking, how did he treat the Old Testament as as an apostle of Jesus?
Well, it's pretty obvious, because in Galatians, when he tells about his own vocation, he tells it in terms of who? Isaiah, Jeremiah. He
Right.
tells how, the nations, the ethnic, they don't say Gentiles. When we translate them, for example, we always say the nations, and he says the Gentiles. So he reads it all as in terms of what is happening right now, of course. And he makes his own conclusion about The questions that were never asked, nowhere in Isaiah does Isaiah ask about circumcision. Nowhere does he ask about kosher. Of course, those are hanging questions. In the same way that Christianity today has to ask certain questions about categories that are not mentioned anywhere, and have to ask about them. So I think he treats it with absolute respect, totally fulfilled with his mission to the Gentiles, but not circumcision for Gentile converts. And that's I think, on kosher, if I'm reading Romans, if I understand Romans, I think in Romans, when the question comes up about whether you can have these joint meals, with kosher for none or kosher for all, in Galatians, he's not going to give an inch. I think he's really uptight after what happened in Jerusalem. No, it's kosher for none. In Romans, all of a sudden, it's much more urbane towards the end of Romans. Well, of course, you're not obliged to observe kosher, but why should you scandalize your brother? If he demands that you keep kosher, it won't kill you to keep kosher, which is actually exactly correct. There is no Christian law that you must eat shellfish. There really isn't.
Right.
Paul, in Galatians, I wanted to tell Paul in Antioch, cool it a bit. Cool it. I mean, I see that you don't want to give an inch because you're afraid it'll take a mile. I see you don't want to give in on kosher because it'll go back to circumcision. It's a circumcision group, he says, that he has trouble with, that James is. So I understand that. You're not going to give an inch. But there's absolutely no problem if I go to a Jewish friend house for a meal. I will wear whatever everyone else does. I will eat what everyone else does. And no, I'm not being a hypocrite, as Paul told Peter and Antioch. Of course, I'm not being a hypocrite. I'm just being courteous. And I bet that's what Peter probably said to Paul in Galatians, when Paul called him a hypocrite, and Barnabas as well. He probably said, Paul, you're such a hard head. Okay, I almost said something impolite. You're such a hard head. But there is no Christian rule that you must observe non-kosher.
Right.
So I consider, I'm talking now like Peter, I don't have to observe kosher if I'm with, and yes, Peter had obviously been eating with Gentiles and not observing kosher. I think that would be Paul's way. If he went to a Gentile house, he wouldn't observe kosher if they weren't. If he went to a Jewish house and they would accept him and were observing kosher, of course he would. Of course he would. That's what he means by with Jews I'm a Jew, with Gentiles I'm a Gentile. That's not hypocrisy, that's courtesy. He would not go to a worship at a pagan temple. He might negotiate, could I go and eat in a temple if there's a feast in a temple and it isn't sacrificial meal? He might argue backwards and forwards on that, because that's open for discussion. He certainly wouldn't go and sacrifice. Absolutely not. But if there was, if he was invited by a Gentile aristocrat, say, to a meal in the temple because the rooms were there for rent, and the meat had been used in a sacrifice, but not by us, could you use it? That's a real question for the first century. And Paul probably would have said yes, and John of Patmos would have screamed no. So these are real questions of what is negotiable, what is not negotiable. Courtesy is always negotiable. Courtesy is always negotiable. Now, Paul would say, in my example, if you go to a Jewish house and you eat, and if people think that you have converted to Judaism, well, it doesn't bother me if I had, but anyway, let's imagine it. No, that's not what you're saying. That is not what you're saying. You might want to do that, but that's not what you're saying. Courtesy means courtesy. Conversion means conversion. So I think Paul would have no trouble with the whole biblical tradition, but he would interpret that way. Now, if I'm a Jew who's a non-messianic, I will simply say, Paul, I don't see it. Where is the Messianic age? I don't hear the anvil chorus, as it were, beating their swords into plowshares. I don't see it. And after the 70s, when the Gentiles streamed to Jerusalem and burned it to the ground, I could see that the future is not probably in the Jewish homeland, and probably not with born Jews to begin with. They've seen the prophecies and they haven't been fulfilled as they see it. So yeah, I could see the inevitability of the parting of the ways. Yes, but I see it, to be honest with you, not because of theology. I see it because of slaughter. I see it because of what happened. The Gentiles came to Jerusalem and they said, no, this is not what Isaiah was talking about.
It was natural for Peter and Paul to sort of wrestle with these questions about Jewish traditions as Jews. You know, that's something you keep stressing, right? Paul was a Jew. One thing I'm wondering is, okay, Paul remained a Pharisee after, but with a new vocation. So how exactly did Paul change when he started to follow Jesus and preach Jesus' gospel to the Gentiles?
Well, to go back to you mentioned Galatians, where I see it most clearly. In one sense, he's he's trying to tell them you're supposed to be leading resurrected lives. Now, he talks about a new creation. He talks about in newness of life. He never quite say you guys are supposed to be in between the beginning of the resurrection and the end of the resurrection. That's what he's saying. You know, first fruits of them that first fruits is the harvest metaphor. And first fruit starts, it continues. It doesn't, start in a year later. So Paul gets away with his theology, which I consider completely correct, by the way, because he doesn't have to answer 2,000 years, which we have to do. I mean, in one sense, the Corinthians only have to lead this. Now, I'm not saying this is a theology for a few minutes. No, but Paul doesn't have to answer long term. He does see one thing, and that's where I see it clearest in Galatians. He says, for example, in this new world, in this new creation, there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Greek nor Gentile. Now, sometimes even my colleagues think, well, those are the social implications. They're not the social implications. They're what the new life looks like. They're not the social implications. That would be like us saying, well, we live in America and the social implications are democracy. No, that's what it means. So let me look at the last one, just that one. Neither slave nor free. But Paul, the Roman Empire is a slave economy. If you were to take that seriously, you're saying there shouldn't be any slaves? I mean, you're not just saying that we shouldn't call one another slaves, or neither slave nor free means the end of slavery. Is that what you're telling us, Paul? Now, if I'm sympathetic to that, I might do what Colossians and Ephesians did. He really means that, of course, there's slavery, but you should be gentle to your slave. And of course, there should be slavery, but slaves should obey willingly. It should be all very lovely. It's kind of a gentler, sweeter slavery. That's not what Paul is saying. He's not violently opposing Roman law and order, but he's destroying the whole basis for it, the economic basis for it. It's
Right,
a
because
slave economy.
you say Paul didn't. You and maybe like half of all New Testament scholars is kind of split. Would say Colossians and Ephesians aren't authentic letters written by Paul. Are you? Are you? But when you do look at the authentic letters written by Paul, where he says there is neither slave nor free, are you calling Paul like an ancient abolitionist?
Of course, Paul thinks everyone should be Christian. I think we all agree with that. In the case of Philemon, we have a case of a runaway slave that Paul sends back and tells his owner, Philemon, do your duty. Well, he can control Christians, as it were, and at least Christians can't have Christian slaves. Now, he's not. If you push him and say, should we go out and preach that everyone? Yeah, he's probably going to. But that's the logic of where he's going. And if I'm anti-Paul, if I'm a pagan against Paul, I'm going to accuse him of telling us that all the slaves should kill their masters and mistresses in their bed in the morning. That's what I'll accuse him of. Of course, it's not true. But I'm going to say, he says there should be neither slave nor free. All right. What he really means is slaves should kill us all and then they'll be free. I know how to get Paul. So that's radical stuff. And I'm using a kind of slogan recently. Who's afraid of the big bad Paul? Most of the New Testament. Because Colossians and Ephesians on this subject, and it's not negotiable for Paul, say, well, of course there's slavery and Christian slavery, but Christian slaves are obedient and Christian masters and mistresses are gentle and kind. That's not what Paul says. Now, I don't think he's out there preaching, everyone get rid of your slave. No, but he's making a statement that, with all due respect, it's the logic of what Jefferson said when he said inalienable rights. Yep. That's hypocrisy, by the way. That's hypocrisy. To say that when you know, well, we're really bracketing slavery for the moment. We won't talk about that. Oh, yeah. You want hypocrisy? You'll find it in the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. You find it in the Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all. Yeah, I mean, if you want to get into that. But when that's a baptismal ceremony. I don't think this is the idea that Paul's said. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we did? He says, in Christ Jesus, look at what comes before that. When you're baptized in Christ Jesus, there is the dump.
Right.
You go down into the waters and you're reborn, is termed a new creation. And you come out of the water, reborn. And what does it look like? Neither male nor female, neither slave nor free, neither Greek. You're reborn into a new creation. Now, that's lovely stuff until you say, okay, and you start asking questions. Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I have a slave? Well, it's all right if I have a slave and he says a pagan. Well, if you had a slave, wouldn't you want him to be a Christian? Trying to live it is going to be very difficult. That's why most of Paul's letters are struggling with his, shall I call them converts? And the more they're trying to live by him, the longer the letters get. Leaving out Romans, which is a kind of a manifesto on his way to Spain, is more trouble with the Corinthians than anyone else because they're trying to live it. If they don't live it, they say, well, this lovely stuff, Paul's Paul, we just go on our way. We just have our meals the way we always had them. If you try to live it, then there's going to be all those questions. What about sex? Would it be better to have no sex? What about that? What about eating? Can we still have, the best tables with better food than the ordinary people? Can we have a feast for the whole community, but we get better wine than they get? Those are Roman questions, by the way, before they were ever. So you can watch Paul trying to live out his vision with people as a community, not just by himself. You can do that. By the letters. That's what they're about.
So, okay, here's another question. How did Paul think of Jesus, right? So he calls him Christ, Jesus, right? Christ, or Messiah.
Yeah.
What did Messiah mean to ancient Jews generally and to Paul specifically? And then further, what did Lord mean? Or I think the Greek word is kurios or something.
Kurios, right? Yeah.
And what do you make of Paul applying Old Testament scriptures about the Lord to Jesus? So I'll give you a few examples. You don't have to respond to like all of them. I'm just thinking in Philippians 2, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that he's Lord, which
Yeah.
is so many allusions to
Yeah.
Old Testament things. Romans 10, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved, in reference to Jesus, which I think was originally in Joel, talking about, God, Yahweh. And then, interestingly, 1 Corinthians 8:6, where he seems to maybe adapt the Jewish Shema, uh, and say, for us, there is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. So those are things that make Paul seem to think very, very highly of Jesus. And I'm just wondering kind of what you make of these terms that Paul uses to describe his leader, his Messiah, his Lord.
And personally, I accept all of those terms and more, personally, as a Christian. But what you've not mentioned, you've mentioned the Old Testament, and I'm certainly, you're quite right in that. I also want to look at Roman imperial theology.
Mm.
Okay. Um, Basically, the thrust of the Old Testament was, I have to go back a ways real fast. The experience of Israel on the Levantine coast, the most dangerous part of the ancient world to live. They were on the high road of empire between Egypt and Mesopotamia, for example, or between the Romans and the Parthians, or the Greeks and the Persians. Our God is just. That's our faith. Our experience is that the world is unjust. But our faith is that God created the world. Now, that's called a crisis. How can we have a just God running an unjust world? Well, the answer: in days to come, God will clean up the mess of the world. Let's not get into fancy language like eschatology and everything. That's the faith. How else can you sustain the dialectic contradiction of a creator of a world who's just when the world is clearly unjust? There was the Assyrians, there was the Babylonians, there was the Medes, there was the Persians, there was the Greeks, there was the Romans. Okay, we got it. We know Daniel. So the world is unjust. How is that tolerable, sustainable, without losing your faith? The only answer that's throughout the Old Testament, various ways. Well, God can be punishing us for our sins. Yeah, that works for a certain amount of time. So we have to repent. Yep, we're doing that. But in days to come, God's going to clean up the mess of the world. Now, no dates given. Days to come, various ways, at the end of days. Second question: when God cleans up the mess of the world, will there be some intermediary? Maybe God will do it for the angels. Will there be some anointed one who will represent God in the great cleanup? That's the second question. It's not a necessary question, but it's the second question. And will that anointed one, the term is, as you well know, in Hebrew it would be Messiah, anglicized Hebrew, anglicized Aramaic, anglicized Greek it would be Christos, Christ. Will this anointed one, who will usher in, control, guide, whatever term you want, the great divine cleanup of the world? Will it be a prophet? Will it be a priest? Will it be a what? Will it be an angel? Be a superhuman being? All of these were available, discussed in the first century. Would it be like David? I think that was probably the most popular conception. It'll be like a new David, and as David led us to freedom from the Philistines 1,000 years ago, so the new David will lead us to freedom from the Romans. And then you could hedge and say, well, will it be just a military leader, or will it be a transcendental figure who will conquer us with the word of his mouth? Anyway, all of that's up for debate. Now, along comes Jesus. As far as we can tell, Jesus does not go around saying, excuse me, I'm the Messiah here. But I am convinced that it only makes sense to me if at least some people during his life said, this is the Messiah, and acted accordingly. It doesn't make any sense to me otherwise. I don't think, well, there was a resurrection, so that made him the Messiah. No, because he was the Messiah, there was a resurrection. So
Mm.
he's called the Messiah, or the Christ, if you're talking Greek. Then he gets all the titles from the Old Testament: the Lord, Redeemer, Savior, any title you want comes roaring in. All right. Now, what must be fed into this? Otherwise, we're just talking about Judaism as if it was living in heaven and not on earth. Judaism is under Rome in the first century. It's an occupied country since at least 60 BCE. And in this occupied country, Caesar has the following titles before Jesus ever existed. He is called Lord, kind of the Lord. He's called God. He's called Son of God. He's called God incarnate. He's called Redeemer from sin, by the way. He's called a Savior, of course, and he's called the Creator of a new world.
Hmm.
All of those titles are, we have evidence of it, given to Caesar, Augustus I'm talking about, of course, not Julius, Augustus Caesar, before Jesus ever existed. So when, in the first century, all those Old Testament ones come in, to say that Jesus is the Lord is not just religion, pious religion anymore. It is also dangerously close to high treason.
Hmm.
Not because there weren't lords all over the place, but when you talk about somebody as the Lord, and this person has followers, we Romans are listening. Because you can have your little Lord, you can have your little God. There's all sorts of little gods out there. Everyone has their little God. But the God, the Son of God, the Lord, all the ones, that's us. And if you're saying something else and hinting that we aren't and you are, then we will crucify you. And if you're still at it, we'll keep doing it. So what's happening with Jesus and with Paul in the first century, that they're both taking the whole long prophetic tradition of the Old Testament, but they're turning it all against Roman imperialism. And not just Rome, as if some other imperialism, but the whole idea of civilization as imperial. Because it's not like the Assyrians were fine, or any of the others were fine, or the Greeks were fine, but the Romans. No, the whole idea of civilization as an imperial phenomenon is under criticism. And all of that is in the Old Testament. It wasn't invented for Jesus. I've been mentioning it again and again. The vision of the Torah, the vision of the prophets, the vision of wisdom was of a world run by justice. And Rome would have said, come on, the world is run by victory. The mighty take it and the others suffer. The rich take what we want and the poor get what's left. Or as Jesus says, the haves have it and the have-nots lose. So I see all of that there in the first century as the climax. And I have no problem with any of that. And when I, as a Christian, are confronted with a choice, is Caesar Lord or is Christ Lord? I know my answer. Christ is Lord. But I can't say that without hearing the echo that means Caesar ain't. And I would know Caesar when I smell him. Because Caesar is autocracy. His title in Greek is Sebastos, the one to be worshipped. His title in Latin is Imperator. Imperator means conqueror. Doesn't mean emperor, it means conqueror, world conqueror in this case. So you're looking at autocracy, you're looking at despotism, and it brings peace to the world. Caesar would say, I bring peace to the world, of course, inside the boundary of the Roman legions. You have peace, of course you do. You have the Pax Romana, as long as you're not on the Danube or the Euphrates or the Rhine. or the Atlas Mountains in Africa. Inside their legionary bases, you have peace. And they boast that peace, but it's a peace bought by victory and sustained, of course, by the legions. Not beating up people in the streets of Alexandria or Antioch or Ephesus or Rome, but on the boundary. That's the genius of the Roman system of territorial empire. So Paul is in the middle of all of this. He's heir to all of Judaism, but he says, now is the time. It's now. It's happening now. So all of the Old Testament is coming to fruition now, and it stands flatly opposed to everything that Rome has announced.
Because it's a different story. There's a difference between just saying, here's another God, Jesus, versus saying, here is the Lord, right? Exclusively, because that's at the expense of Roman imperial theology.
Yeah, look, sorry. I was going to say, sorry, go on. I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I'm rude.
It's okay.
Go on, please.
Just what if I ask you directly, do you think Paul saw Jesus as like capital G God, Yahweh?
Well, he calls Jesus the image of God. For Paul, this is what God looks like in sandals. Now, if some Roman took a sword and assassinated Jesus, did God die? Of course not. But he means with absolute full, Jesus is the image of God. Now, let me use a kind of a crude example, come down from the sublime to the ridiculous. If you walk into my study, you see a picture on the desktop. It's Sarah, my beloved wife. And if you said to me, is that Sarah? I would say, of course. I wouldn't say, oh, no, that's just an image of Sarah. No, Paul considers Jesus is the image of God. But he doesn't think, well, there's another one somewhere else. Yeah, there's another one over in Rome, claims to be the image of God. No, I mean, this is let me put this in serious modern language. If I go up and start walking around Washington, D.C., saying, I am the president. Now, in that context, the Secret Service is always going immediately to be wanting to know what I am. Now, if I say, oh, I'm simply, back home, I'm in the president of the local library. Well, why are you walking around here saying I am the president? Why didn't you say I'm the president of the local library in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, wherever? No. When Paul is writing, for example, and he says, Jesus is my Lord, that wouldn't raise a Roman eyebrow. Yeah, sure. In fact, we all have our little lords, of course. We all have our little gods. We understand all that stuff. But don't say that your Lord is the Lord. See, that's treason. So now you have your little Lord, Paul, and by all means, you can worship your little Lord. We won't do anything about it. You can have your little statue of whatever. Just don't keep saying he's the Lord. Or don't say he's the image of God. Hey, we're all images of God. No, it's the language that makes it treasonous. And it's precisely in Washington, in the day, if I do it, say, on a certain date, maybe when there's a inauguration, it's explosive. I could get myself killed. Because if I'm saying I am the president, and am I saying he ain't, well, what's my intention? Why is my arm inside my coat? I could get shot in context. So I'm trying to ask people to understand, yes, all of the Old Testament tells us to wait for something. This is the image of God, Paul. Can you execute the image of God? This is what horrifies Paul. Read 1 Corinthians, the first 3 chapters. He has to ask himself, why did God, let me use Paul's language, why did God allow or tolerate or decree or decide that when the Messiah came, Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, he would be executed legally by the greatest empire the world had ever known. Why did God allow that?
Right.
That's Paul's question.
He calls the cross what? A stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles.
Exactly. And it's a stumbling block to Paul because in First Corinthians, his answer is God allowed this. I'll use a vague term. Allowed this because God wanted to reveal to the human race the savage heart of civilization.
Hmm.
That's what he says when he says execution of Jesus. He's talking about none of the archontes, none of the rulers of the world understood what was going on. If they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory.
Hmm.
Paul's understanding of the execution and why God, I could use a strong term, Paul might even say God decreed, God allowed, God tolerated, God foretold from all eternity for Paul. He calls this the mystery in Romans, the mystery. No, from all eternity, God knew that when the Messiah came, to use Pauline language, not that Jesus was sitting up in heaven waiting, but Messiahship was waiting in heaven, as it were. When Messiahship descended from heaven onto Jesus, to put it crudely, Rome would execute him. And Paul would say, what price law? Why did God allow this? This is a Pauline question. 1 Corinthians, the first 3 chapters. This is the clash between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the world, stupidity of the world, and this what God considers stupid. It is to reveal to the human race, don't you see what you would do? When the Messiah was on earth, you would have executed him. You wouldn't lynch him. You wouldn't just have an accident. You would legally, publicly, officially execute him. That, says Paul, it reveals the savage heart of civilization. And therefore, going to the other end of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, God in resurrection already revealed, the time of Jesus, the cosmic justice of God. So execution, resurrection for Paul are two sides of like a divine coin. One reveals to us who we are and warns us about who we are, and the other reveals who God is and offers us an alternative. So I see that now as close as I can to the beating heart of Paul. His attempt to understand as he becomes a Messiah. Was it just an accident, bad luck? Yep. No. It was the mystery of God known from all eternity, he says. That's his language, not mine.
The beating heart of Paul. I really appreciate that response. I have a few more brief questions, or really
Okay.
they're big questions that call for big answers, but I'll try to be concise.
Okay. All right.
How how did Paul's preaching of the gospel preserve Jesus' own vision of God's rule, God's kingdom? And also, how might Paul and Jesus have differed in their approaches?
Well, they differed radically in their constituency. To put it bluntly, Jesus spent most of his life in the teeny, tiny hamlets of Galilee, southern Galilee even. That was his constituency, the peasants in Galilee, for whom he used parables to draw them in and get them to think about God's rule. But Jesus' claim, as far as I was concerned, is that God's rule is here. And that is coming soon. It's here already. And to get them to try and think for themselves and see that for themselves, because he's calling them to participate in it. They're not going to say, oh, yeah, we got it, Jesus. God's rule is here. Nice. Have a nice day. If God's rule is here, it is either operational or it ain't here. It's not just here like a mist, a morning mist. It's here only insofar as you accept it and live it and take it upon yourself. So that's his And I have no reason to think, honestly, I don't know if I can prove it, but that people listening to Jesus wouldn't have said, is he the Messiah? Do you think? Yeah, but he's not like David. He's not, I don't see the sword. I don't know. And I have no problem with somebody else saying, I don't know if this ever happened. Well, you want to know? That's my idea of a Lord, not this jerk on this coin.
Hmm.
I don't know that ever happened, but it's in the world. Every silver coin, not the bronze coins, every silver coin has Caesar on it and says he's DVF. But if you want to know a son of God, I can see somebody saying, this is my type of a son of God. I mean, it's possible. So I don't have to believe, oh, this all happened later. It's all there in the ambience. Okay. Um,
Well,
so I can
when
imagine that
Jesus,
happening.
oh sorry,
Sorry. Go on.
when
No.
Jesus preaches about God's rule, the kingdom of God calls for collaboration. So when he says the kingdom
Yeah.
is at hand, um, I mean, sometimes he's really clear. Like if I cast out demons by the finger of
Yeah.
God, then the
Yeah.
kingdom of God has already arrived. Like sometimes he's
Yes.
very clear, it's here. But other times he does seem to speak about the kingdom of God as a future hope, sort of. So would you like? Is it right to describe Jesus' view of the kingdom as a present sort of collaborative process, still awaiting a final consummation, or is it completely present?
Well, yes. I mean, the answer to the way you put it is yes. And the second thing is
Okay.
that Christians and interpreters have used final consummation as a way of gutting the first part.
Mm.
Okay. It's like, if a student says, okay, I'm starting now my doctoral program. Okay, you've started it. Are you in the university? Have you signed up? Are you taking your first classes? Oh, no, no, no. Then you you haven't started yet. Now, once you start, you'll be able to say it'll come to an end, certainly, and you do this and have 2 years, 3 years, 4, whatever. So when Jesus is saying, of course, it's here insofar as you collaborate, will it come to a consummation? Of course, he takes it for granted it'll come to a consummation. If you push him, will it come to a consummation soon? I think Jesus' answer would be, get on with it.
Mm.
Why do you want to ask about the end when I'm trying to talk about the beginning or the
Mm-hmm.
present? Why do you want to talk about the end when I want to talk about this? Go back to my example of the student. Well, I have to write a dissertation. Get going. Don't talk to me about the end. Graduation. Talk to me about going. So we've been saying that for years. It's both a present here and consummation. And then we forget all about the present and want to know how it's going to end. That's the great cop out.
Mm. But
If
Jesus
I
is
can go
saying,
back
right now, follow
right
me, eat
now,
with sinners and tax collectors, be humble,
that's right.
put yourself
Right now,
last.
right now. Rome did not really crucify you for the future. It crucified you for doing something right now that's bringing in followers. So what Jesus is saying is the kingdom is here only insofar as we make it. I can't. You say, Jesus, are you the kingdom? How can you have a kingdom of one? And you say, well, are you the king? Well, how can you have a king without a kingdom? The language is communal language. We want to say, I know it's not just you, we say this all the time. Well, it's already here pending consummation. That's the great cop out. And after
Mm.
2,000 years, I think we should call it. You might have got away with it in the first century. I don't know about Jesus, honestly. I really don't. It depends what words you think he said. If he said Mark 9:1, then of course he thinks it's in his own lifetime. Paul did. Anyone who said in the first century it's coming soon is wrong unless they want to be liars. I'd say by soon they really meant 2,000 years and counting. No, they
Mm.
didn't. Soon meant in our lifetime. COVID will be over soon, a couple of years. Certainly not 2000. Soon usually is a very elastic term. So I think the old idea of in days to come was fed back into. It's here already, but in days to come, it'll be over. It won't be over until it begins. So could we concentrate on the presence of the kingdom requiring our participation and shut up after 2,000 years about the great red herring that we've been using? I'm not talking about you. We've been all using it. It started now, but it's not over. Of course it's not over. Look around you. Watch the evening news. It's not only not over, it's getting worse. You know, the Romans, in their worst day of slaughter, couldn't destroy the Mediterranean. They couldn't take down the olive trees. We have weapons that can destroy the world. We're getting on with it in the wrong direction. Okay, so yes, I would say yes to that, but anyone who says it, I'd be very careful if they're using it as a cop-out.
Right. Yeah, a big issue is focusing so much on the future, even like in modern kind of evangelism, the way we try to get people to convert is so that you can, after you die, you can like be with Jesus in heaven in the
Yeah.
future, right? Or so that you can avoid, hell in the future. But what about the peace beyond all understanding that Jesus offers now, right? Or the abundance of life and life more abundantly, right? Zoe in Greek
Yeah.
that Jesus
Our
offers now.
God's
That
God so loved the world. God so loved the
yes, God's
world.
love now.
Now we're in it. So
Right. And so there has to be a big focus on following Jesus in this lifetime and repent for the kingdom of God is at hand. That's Mark's summary of Jesus' gospel. But still there is talk about, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but talk about God, a divine intervention towards the end that I don't know if we collaborate with or like we need. It doesn't just happen without us, but it's still very much on God's part, right? So I think when Jesus uses the language of like God, the Son of Man will come in power with the angels of God, and you talk about judgment, which is a central feature of sort of the eschaton, and even Paul talking about the trumpets and everything in 1 Thessalonians 4. It seems like the focus, yes, should be on present collaboration, but there also is this very grand hope for future divine intervention. Do you think I'm
oh
missing
yeah.
something here? No?
No,
Yeah?
no. What you are saying is a loud voice of 2,000 years. And I'm calling it. I'm really not talking to you personally. I really am.
Right. Yeah,
Because
no, I
what you're
understand.
saying, I recognize completely. That's what we've been saying for 2,000 years. And it is the great cop-out. Let's talk about the future. Let's even argue about what heaven is like. Let's do all of that stuff. And I would be willing to say, fine, I don't even want to talk about that. I don't even want to argue. If you want to know what I think, that's a separate issue. I'm talking about whether are okay. I'm talking about whether we are a magnificent but doomed species. That's what I'm talking about. We Homo sapiens, and sapiens means wise, and we ain't wise. It's a very ironic species. That's what I want to talk about. If somebody wants to talk about will there be a great divine intervention? No, because I don't see any evidence it ever has happened. I think the great divine interventions are Jesus. We didn't recognize it. We're still waiting for divine intervention. Where was the bang crash? Jesus's vision of the world, how to save our species. Isaiah's vision of how to save our species. I mean, it's there. The only difference that I see is in the Bible, what endangers our species in the Bible is war. That they see. And they don't even know yet, honestly, what we know about war. But even by then, they knew, because little Israel could be destroyed by any of these empires. Be simply wiped out. Just wiped out. You know, lost in the gene pool of the Middle East. That could happen. So they could imagine that. Now, we can imagine that for the whole world. We really can. But what has happened now is we have two other cataclysmic visions lapping the first one, to use an. One is what we call accelerated climate change. The accelerated weapons of mass destruction could destroy the world. That we've got. That's all the way from the Old Testament to now. Nothing about accelerated climate change anywhere in there. But now we know we can do it. We can do it. We can do it. And what's even more horrible, we can almost do it casually. I mean, at least we can't wipe out the world with atomic bombs by accident. I hope we can't do it by accident. I hope we can't do it by accident. But this other thing can happen. Accelerated climate change. And there's a third one, which is overpopulation. And by overpopulation, I do not mean we have too many people. I mean we have too many people in one place and not enough somewhere else. It's called immigration. That's how we see the population explosion. So any of these can pretty much destroy the world. We have three ways of destroying the world now. The Bible only knew one, really: war. And they were not even really imagining it on a global scale, actually. It was just a hope. So we have serious work to do here. If you think there is a divine intervention, like a great lifeboat there, I think what we have to recognize, if I stick with that metaphor, we, the human species, are not the Titanic. We are the iceberg. We are the iceberg. And we're three ways the iceberg. So that's the challenge of our species. And whether you're a theist or an atheist, I think that's the challenge of evolution that I see. That our species is capable, and we are the only species that's ever been so capable, of destroying not only ourselves. You could imagine another species doing that, though it's probably protected against it by evolution, but you could imagine. Suppose you could imagine the lions and the Serengeti killing all the gazelles and starving to death. I suppose you could imagine it, but they're probably being protected from such stupidity by evolution. We aren't. We are not protected, except that when we came out of, going back to the Bible, maybe to end it there, when we came out of the Garden of Eden, all we had going for us, according to the Bible, is the knowledge of good and evil. Not knowledge, but the knowledge of good and evil is called conscience. The only thing that protects us from doing any of those three destructions of the human race is conscience. That's the only answer I have. If somebody says, well, why should I care if 100 years from now where the world is, I'll be gone? I can only talk of conscience. I don't know any other answer.
That's one unique thing about your approach, because you're a New Testament scholar, you're a historian, but you put it into a much larger global evolutionary perspective. And so you're not just wondering why Paul was an important figure 2,000 years ago, but what relevance he has for the modern man today, religiously, but also just evolutionarily. Like, uh-oh, where'd you go? Looks like he went off. Let me email him. Oh, he's back. Hello?
Hi.
You good?
Did I lose you or did you lose me or what happened?
I don't know. It just seemed like you logged off for a second, but you're back,
No,
so that's all that matters.
I think my electricity must have gone off. I live in
Ah,
Florida. Lots of time we
okay.
have lighting. I didn't do anything manually. We're probably almost finished in any case. Is
Right.
anything else? You can edit this out. Can you clean this up?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Okay.
So, anyways, yeah, you just put it into the larger evolutionary perspective. Um, if I could ask maybe one more question, a pretty
Sure.
just broad, conclusive question. Finally, how would you, as a historian, summarize the life and teachings of the historical Paul, the Messianic Pharisee?
Okay.
It's a big one.
All right. Let me put it this way. If I were to let me put it as a sort of a question and answer. The question I would ask Paul, dear Paul, all of these titles, Lord, God's Savior of the world, Creator of new earth, Son of God, God, all of these titles, I find attributed to Caesar, the Augustus Sebastus, before I find them applied to Jesus, the Messiah Christ. Now, Paul, what does that mean to you? And here's what I think Paul would say to us. It's about a new creation. Please take that seriously. It's about a new creation. Well, you mean just we'll fix up the old creation, be a little kinder, gentler? Paul is telling us there will be a new creation or there will be no creation. And if I were to say to him, well, Paul, you mean the creation in Genesis didn't work? I think Paul would say, yeah, it didn't work because you didn't participate. You were called to run the world by God, to put in charge of the world, and to run it according to justice, the Sabbath vision of justice, and you didn't do it. So Jesus is calling you to a new creation, which is really a renewed creation. So maybe if I put it in, when Paul said new creation, he meant renewed creation. We always think of new means the old is gone. Of course, the ancient world, they trusted the old. The new was what they were suspicious of. So if you claimed anything was new, it'd be much safer to say renewed, brought up to the moment. So Paul is telling us that the creation of Genesis 1 was renewed by Jesus the Messiah. Get with the program.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that summary. That's like
I don't know if that's just kind of off the
n-
top of my head, but
no, yeah, that it's you're getting exactly to what I was asking, but also you're approaching it in a creative way, like answering the question with a question to Paul, but then
yeah.
explaining that his central to his teaching was a vision of renewed creation in which we are called to participate. Is that right?
Yeah. That's it.
There you
That's
go.
it. Yeah.
All right. So
All right.
yeah, thank you so much for your time. I used a lot of it just now, but it was informative for me. I hope it's been educational and challenging for our audience. So just
Yes.
thank you again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. So to you and to everyone else, peace.